This is the title of my presentation today, Testing Policy Effects in Reducing Organized Crime through Dynamic Multi-Layered Networks and Agent-Based Modeling. So this is a presentation that Eduardo already did, so we can really skip this. And just to expand on that, I have a criminological expertise that mostly focuses on organized crime, terrorism, and urban crime. My PhD dissertation, for example, is on terrorism, but the work I'm going to present today, and most of the activities, the research activities that I've been following during my experience at Transcrime were on organized crime. Now, in the last 2 years, I've also started to work on urban crime as well, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of how the COVID-19 pandemic really impacted crime trends in different American cities. So my research again seeks to investigate patterns and dynamics related to this free phenomena, and in the areas mostly of machine learning, Bayesian modeling on complex networks, and graph learning. This last area is the one on which I'm working with Eduardo and other colleagues at Boise State on an article, for example. But the machine and deep learning area is more of related to my previous terrorism activity and my doctorate. So this is the outline of the seminar today. I'm gonna introduce you with some sort of an overview of the Proton project, which is the project from which the work that I'm presenting today come. And then I'm gonna go over the study specifically, and then I'm gonna have some concluding reflection on computational criminology that I hope will foster some discussion afterward. So the Horizon 2020 project Proton. So the work presented comes from this Horizon 2020 project. What is Horizon 2020? It's one of the most ambitious research funding schemes of the European Commission. The project Proton was funded with a total of more than 4 million euros and started in 2016 and ended in 2019. And at an overall level aimed at combining computational and social sciences to analyze recruitment into organized crime groups and terrorist networks. Transcrime and Catholic University, which were the university and the research center where I was working at the time, acted as a leader of a consortium of more than 20 partners, including research institutions, private companies, NGOs, and policymakers. These in the picture are some of the institutions that were collaborating with us on the project. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem was the co-coordinator of the project, but then we also had the University of Maryland on the terrorism side, IBM on the cybercrime domain, and then the Free University of Amsterdam on the organized crime part, specifically related to the Dutch context. And then we also had a Consiglio Nazionale della Ricerca, Italian National Research Council, that worked with us part of the simulation that I'm gonna show you and introduce to you today. And then we also had other policymakers like UNODC and Europol that helped us in characterizing and informing our studies in order to give us the context, and also to let us understand what policymakers were expecting from such kind of a project. So the project was mainly divided into two tracks. The first phase that was aimed at gathering new knowledge on organized crime and terrorism recruitment through a set of innovative studies, for example, mafias, Italian mafias, or Italian organized crime. I conducted with my team a statistical analysis of the criminal careers of the entire population of offenders convicted for mafia offenses in Italy. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem did the same with terrorists that were convicted in Israel, and so on. And this kind of a first phase that kind of lasts for 1.5 years helped us in collecting inputs and try to understand and gathering new knowledge on these two phenomena, so organized crime and terrorism. And all this knowledge was kind of exploited in the second phase that lasted mostly 1.5 years. So the other, let's say, half of the time of the project for developing agent-based simulations that could be used by researchers or policymakers to assess the possible effects of public intervention to counter recruitment into organized crime and terrorism network. Problem with policymaking and research in these fields, so for example, organized crime and terrorism, is that it is really difficult to run randomized controlled trials or to test policies in an ethical way. You have a lot of problems from a political and ethical point of view. So the overall idea was that bringing together social and computational sciences could offer a new tool for policymakers to try to understand what could be the effects of some policies in advance before testing them. And today, I'll specifically presenting the results of the organized crime-related outcomes of the project, and particularly of the second phase of the project. So, study. First of all, I'm going to introduce you with some concepts that are necessary to really understand and grasp what we're talking about here, especially because I'm assuming most of you come from a non-social science background, a non-criminological background. So some of the information are really useful to really understand what goes into the project and goes beyond the computational side of it. So organized crime, I'm going to adopt here the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime definition. That is kind of a really broad, because it tries to get together and include the entire spectrum of organized crime groups that exist overall at the global level. The definition says that a criminal organization is a group of 3 or more persons existing over a period of time, acting in concert with the aim of committing crimes for financial or material benefit. So these are really general definitions. Criminologists have tried over the years to find comprehensive definitions that were, let's say, inclusive, but at the same time less general, but really struggled because organized crime is really characterized by different geographical, economic, social, and historical characteristics, and this really makes it difficult to find a comprehensive definition. So Italian mafias, for example, are infamously considered the archetype of crime. This is partially due to their power and to their role in the organized crime scenario at the global level, but also, from the impact that popular culture, like the cinema culture, for example, literature had on the topic. However, these is really, Italian mafias are far from being the only serious organized crime typology present overall in the world right now. So we have, for example, Mexican drug cartels that are probably now tougher than Italian mafias in their recourse to violence and in their economic power. And then we have Russian mafias that move from former Soviet Union to Europe and also to the United States. Then we have the Yakuza, Chinese triads, and both these Asian groups have now moved and expanded transnationally. And then we have the Dutch organized crime, which is probably the only one in this list that really has more of a national outlook rather than a transnational one. And then we also have Nigerian mafias that moved from Africa to Europe, Italy as well. They are now combining their efforts and resources with some Italian mafias here, but move also to other continents like the United States and North America in general. So the study focus here will be on Italian mafias. Just to give you an overview on Italian mafias, a really brief one. Italian mafia is the, let's say, umbrella word that combine together the different criminal organizations that are present in Italy today, that are mostly 4. So we have Camorra, the first one, which is the one that, I don't know if you follow the Gomorrah drama series on Netflix, but it's not on Netflix, but the television series, and that is the organized crime group that is pictured in the series. So it's the organized crime group that really act in the Neapolitan area. Then we have Sacra Corona Unita, which acts here in the Apulian region. Then we have 'Ndrangheta, which acts in the Calabrian region here, the Deep South. And then we have Sicilian Mafia, which is the archetype of the archetype. Sicilian Mafia was the type of Italian mafias that moved to the United States in the early 20th century. And we are talking in this particular study here, we are taking the perspective of the Sicilian Mafia, and particularly on the Sicilian Mafia in the area of Palermo, which is the black circle here. So we have the island here, and in the top we have the Palermo region, which is probably the most central the most central area for the development of the Sicilian Mafia over the course of history. So the aim and method of the study, as I partially introduced before, the aim was to simulate a realistic virtual society and specifically recruitment into organized crime to further test the impact of different policies on organized crime, to try to understand how to prevent and counter and reduce the phenomenon. The methodology adopted was agent-based modeling. Those of you who don't know what agent-based modeling is, it is a computational methodology that is designed to model the actions of autonomous interacting computational agents at the micro level to study the emergence of macro phenomena. And it really originated in the realm of cellular automata, but now it is a kind of an independent and autonomous field that intersects its trajectory with other fields like reinforcement learning and artificial intelligence, for example, complex systems in a more of a physics-oriented perspective. And it is being adopted to model and understand and predict the behavior of different systems and complex systems like biological ones, social ones. And in the last 2 decades, we witnessed an increasing application also in criminology. So we have a lot of studies that try to map how crime develop and evolve and move across different spheres and different domains, geographical domains especially. But this is the first study that really does this in the fashion of looking at organized crime per se. So theoretical perspective, I don't want to bother you with theory here, but it is really important because the theory behind the computational model really motivated and helped us in framing the problem in an empirically driven way, and also in helping us connecting with the criminological literature. So we relied on a empirically and theory-driven model here, and we tried to combine together different theoretical perspectives that were really used in the past decades to try to explain crime in a mutually exclusive fashion. So we have differential association and social learning theory in the first place, and these 2 theories, I'm not going to go deep on that, but these 2 theories really look at the relational environment as a driver that can explain crime. So the more you're exposed to pro-crime and pro-crime or deviant environment, the higher the number of relations that you have in your neighborhood that are characterized by deviant behavior, the higher the likelihood that you're gonna join criminal enterprises. So really, it's more of a structural problem here. But the general theory of crime, on the other side, really posits that instead it's not just a structural thing, but it is more so crime. It is more a matter of low self-control. So in the individual attributes of every single person can expose him to criminal behavior. So you have some risk factors at the individual level, and these are really the drivers that puts you at risk of committing crime. So our intuition here was that OC involvement, so organized crime, it is really relational. You cannot really think about organized crime without having in mind, relations between people. So our intuition is that OC involvement is a joint effect of both structural relational factors and individual attributes. So an individual with low self-control that lives in a highly pro-social environment will hardly join an OC group. The person will potentially commit a crime, but if you live in a really pro-social area, it's really hard for you to get into an organized crime group. On the other side, an individual with high self-control that lives in a high OC-prone environment may not end at joining an OC group. Okay, so not all the people that live and grow up in difficult areas where organized crime is really salient end up being organized criminal. So the key here is a combination of the 2 perspectives. And the structure of the model is really mirrors this kind of intuition. So we simulate a virtual society in which agents hold individual level characteristics beyond the relational sphere. So for example, age is a risk factor. Of course, if you are 5 years old, the risk that you are going to end up joining an organized crime group is likely really low. But if you end up having, 18 years or 20 years or 25 years, you are at the peak of what is called age crime cure. So the risk of joining a criminal enterprise is higher. And then, but they are also embedded in a multi-layered network structure. So every one of us, without being a criminal, of course, is embedding every day in different type of networks. So we try to model this kind of relational structure in the more realistic way. And these two dimensions are reflected into two functions, let's say. So we have a function, which is the crime commission function, which is based on individual level characteristics. So an agent in the simulation can commit a crime without being associated with an organized crime group. Okay, it can commit a crime because it has some sort of risk factors, but the agent here is not really embedded in a OC Pro network. And then we have the ER function, which is an OC embeddedness function that really tells us how much your environment, based on the multi-layer network structure of your neighborhood, is really OC Pro. And that these two functions probabilistically jointly determine recruitment into OC. So when an agent in our simulation co-offends, so commit a crime with another agent that is already an OC member, it gets recruited. So it becomes part of an OC group. So the data to inform the entire model here, I think this is one of the strengths of the model compared to previous works in the area of criminology. And this says that all the information that we have used, let's say 90%, because in some cases not really available, but all information inputs used to calibrate and validate the models come from real world data, and particularly again from the context of Palermo and systems. So we retrieve data on demography and households, fertility and mortality rates, employers and employment, socioeconomic status and education, criminal networks, co-funding networks that are separate. We have criminal networks and co-funding, and then also friendship networks. And most data come from the Italian Institute of Statistics, the European Statistical Office, the Bank of Italy, and some other data come from a really tight cooperation with the municipality of Palermo. So this is a sort of a multi-layered society that we thought about for setting up our model here. This is an illustration. It's a proof of concept of how it works. Each of us is really embedded, as I told before, in different layers of different networks every day. Hopefully, none of us is in co-funding one. So let's pretend that we have only 5 here. But in the Palermo context and in any other context, there are also co-funding networks that are really relevant to map how people behave and how recruitment dynamics occur in a real world scenario. So we have household networks that really talk about the families and how the families are distributed in the city of Palermo. That we have kinship, and we have schools. So our agents grow, and they first have some sort of relation that go beyond the family dimension at school. But then people also make relations at their work and professional places, and that's important in explaining, for example, some sort of co-funding patterns in some part of the world. So, for example, the Dutch case, a lot of organized crime enterprises that are really less serious than the Italian ones occur and comes from professional opportunities. So people, for example, that work at airports and that finally find opportunities to smuggle drugs. And that's a sort of an example here. So we had to model that as well. Then friendship networks are really important to understand how society work, and even how criminal opportunities occur, according to the social learning theory that I had mentioned before. And then co-funding network again, which is important to model the criminal structure of a society. So this is the simulation mechanism overview. This is the entire structure. So we have, starting from the bottom here, we have a multiplexity thing that I just introduced to you. And then from the multiplexity thing, we derive some agent, from some network attributes for the agents. And these network attributes are helping us in, first of all, informing us on the organized crime embeddedness function R, but also in trying to inform us on the probability of committing a crime C. And then we also have agents' individual attributes. I'll go into detail about these two dimensions later, but this is just to try to introduce you on the broader overview of the entire mechanisms here. We have agents' individual attributes that are used to inform and to populate the equation for explaining the probability of committing a crime. Then these two dimensions together end up being the drivers, the decisive drivers for recruitment. And you have to think about recruitment as occurring in a probabilistic fashion. So the C function and the R function are probabilistically informing us on the dynamics of recruitment. And each probabilistic function and each probabilistic structure of the model, again, is informed using real world data. And then, of course, we have model outcomes based on the recruitment patterns, and the model outcomes will be used to evaluate the policies that I'm going to talk in a bit about in a bit. So the modeling crime commission. So this is the C function. So we have the probability of committing a crime, which is a joint function of the baseline probability, which is given by the probability of your gender, your sex, and your age class. And then you have also this summation of risk factors that are non-related to your gender and to your age class. So and then you have also stochastic terms here that allows us to avoid ending up with overly deterministic mechanisms. So at each time of reference, we decided to keep the population baseline probability C, given G and A, fixed at each timestamp. So it means that the distribution of C is modeled as a strictly stationary and ergodic random process. What it means that individual level probabilities, C probabilities, are varying across the population, but the average probability remains the same. So we don't have shifts at the entire at the population level, but we have only shifts in the probability of committing the crime that pertain particular subsamples or strata of the population. And that was a decision that was definitely a subjective decision, but it was necessary because otherwise our model would have ended up having an explosion of the probability on the average probability of committing a crime for each agent, and a complete unrealistic outcome. So the idea is that and which is an assumption, but it is not really hard to think about that. But so in general, the average probability of committing a crime for a society in 2020 will be the same with some sort of bandwidth compared to the probability of committing a crime for the average population in 2000. And these are the age and gender baseline probabilities. So the C and G and A here. We derive them from real world data. And this is the trajectory here based on the age class. What it is really striking is that males have far higher probability of committing a crime. You see that a person in Palermo context at the age between 25 and 35 and 44 has a probability that is around 30% of committing a crime. So you have this peak, this curve here is the age crime curve, and it is really something that is an established pattern in the criminological literature across many geographical domains, even in the United States. So it really reflects what is happening all over the world here. And then, of course, but you have some sort of a trajectory also for women. So even though the probability for committing a crime for women is really lower compared to men, you still have some peaks here, and the peak for women really comes later in life, probably due to an effect of marriage. So potentially women that get married with people that are involved in crime end up in this kind of a trajectory of deviant behavior, and that's why the peak it comes after compared to men. So these are the baseline probabilities, and starting from these probabilities, we have these risk factors that modify the function and the overall probability of committing a crime. So, for example, having the odds ratio of being unemployed is 1.30. It means that being unemployed is a risk factor, and it means that it adds to your baseline probability being a man in 25 to 45 to 44 age class. If you're unemployed, then your risk increases. And then, of course, it goes in combination with these other risk factors that have been selected based on systematic reviews of the literature on crime commission and crime involvement. So we have education. So not having an high school diploma is a risk factor for organized crime, committing a crime. Then you have natural propensity, which is one of the very few variables that are not based on real world data. So we have distributed it as a log normal function in the population. And then we have the criminal history. So if you have a criminal history, you have a high odds ratio and a higher risk of becoming a criminal again. And then, of course, criminal family. If your heritage is a criminal one, unfortunately, you have some, a higher probability of committing a crime in your life. Then criminal friends and co-workers, which reflects again the social learning perspective. And then, of course, OC membership. We also derive the odds ratio for committing a crime when you're already part of an OC or an organized crime group, and it is strikingly high. So you have an odds ratio 5 if you are an OC member. So this means that really the entire number of crimes in a society, they are disproportionately committed by organized crime members rather than common criminals. And this brings us to the second part, so the R function and the modeling embeddedness in organized crime. So as I told you before, we model our society as a multiplex network, with each single network that is based on vertices and edges, really basic stuff here. And then we define for each single layer network, we define an H-hope neighborhood graph, which I think was a free hope neighborhood graph, so that we can, let's say, isolate the neighborhood of each agent. And these functions here, equations here, really tells us how this how this is done formally. So we have for each layer within our multiplex society, and for each agent, we have six local networks. And this kind of tells us which are the persons and which are the individuals, the agents that each agent interact with. So we assume that these interactions are, some sort of a proxy of a stable relation that can drive criminal commission, or, for example, marriage. Because the thing about the simulation is that this structure, this framework, this multi-layer structure, this multi-layer framework allow us to not only to really model criminal commission, which is the focus of the presentation and the focus of the work, but also allow us to, for example, model marriage mechanisms or friendship and cooperation mechanisms. Then we have to try to define here what the R function is. So think about each local neighborhood, and think about the local neighborhood for each agent as transformed in a vectorized fashion. So the vector is really the list of the weights that are associated to each connection in the H-op local network for each agent, and each weight is distributed following these inverse relation here. So the longer, let's say, the diameter between two agents, the shorter, the lighter the weight of the relation. And then for computing the embeddedness, we first get this vector with the sum of vectors is the sum of the vector for each local network in each layer in the multi-layer structure. So we end up having a single vector in the end that gives us the amount of weights that each agent share across different layers in the multi-layered network. And yes, so this equation, yes, the resultant vector of weights deriving the complete agent H-op network across, again, all the layers. But then to calculate the actual OC embeddedness, we also derive the same resultant vector of weights only obtained from the H-op OC network. So instead of taking all the agents in the local network of each agent, we take only those agents that are part of an OC group. And then basically the ratio between, at each timestamp and for each agent, the ratio between the the sum of vectors, the resultant vectors of weights obtained from the agents HOC network divided by the resultant vector for the entire local networks gives us an idea of how embedded is an agent in an OC Pro network. So the value ends up being between 0 and 1. And this proposed method implicitly weights the OC embeddedness, such as two important features are respected. First, the importance of OC ties is inversely proportional to distance. So if I'm really close and I have a direct link with an OC agent, the weight, of course, will be higher, while if the OC agent is in my local neighborhood, but it is more distant, so at a pre-out distance, then the weight, of course, gets more. The importance of ties is generally proportional to the number of different relations shared between any two individuals. So if you have a diverse network across all the layers, the risk of being embedded in an OC Pro network is definitely lower. And these finally are the policies that we're going to test. So once we have tested it, once we have modeled the dynamics of recruitment into organized crime and crime commission, then we're going to test these 4 policies. So we have the first one. The first 2 policies are really more of a law enforcement oriented policies. So the first one, it targets OC leaders. So what it means that we increase the probability of arrest of a leader whenever he of a leader of an OC group, whenever he commits a crime. And OC leaders are defined as the agents that have the highest degree of centrality in the OC network present in the model. Then we also have the targeting of facilitators. So facilitators are those agents that are not OC members, but that really facilitate the flow of communication between agents that are already within an OC group and people that are not a member of an OC group. So think about some professional categories like people that works in like attorneys or other types of professional categories that have been empirically demonstrated to have some sort of a connection many times especially with the financial sphere of organized crime. So we wanted to model these 2 policies. So first of all, we target the classic one. We target the leaders, we target the kingpin, but then we also wanted to understand what is the effect of targeting the facilitators. So targeting this kind of gatekeepers in the relations between the organized crime group and the rest of the society. And then we also model these 2 policies that were more related to a socialization sphere. The first one is that, and this is actually something that has been done in Italy in the last years. So it is a really particular policy. So when a child is living in an OC Pro network and the mother reports this to the police, the authorities cut the relation between the child and the OC father. So the father, which is already a member of an OC group, and in the meanwhile gives some sort of a welfare support to the mother and allows the children to get a higher educational degree. So once the children reach age 18, then the ties with the father are reestablished, because of course then when you're 18 you can go back to your family. And then you have the secondary socialization policy, where you have we target school children at risk by selecting schools, children that are school age, and we try to increase their social and welfare support, so they will complete high school and they will try to facilitate the trajectory in getting higher levels of education. And also the random links with pro-social and non-delinquent peers and adults will be created. So you have this sort of a later policy while the first one comes in place when the child is really just a child, when the second one targets people that are already in school age and allows them to have this sort of more of a pro-social environment. So really 4 policies, but with 2 really different philosophies behind. Some simulation executing details. Each ABM is initialized with 30 OC members and an annual crime rate of 2,000 offenses per 10,000 inhabitants. And this is again driven. This is really derived from real world data. Each simulation is populated with 3,000 agents and run for a total of 360 steps, and each step is modeled as being a year. So we've simulated society for a whole range of 30 years to have an idea of the long term and the medium term effect policies. And then each policy scenario starts around step. So uh, after a year. So the simulation is, sorry, I was wrong before. We have 360 steps, and each step is a month. So after 12 months, after 1 year, each policy gets started, and each scenario is repeated 60 times with different pseudo-random initialization to avoid the problem of some sort of stochasticity and end up having more robust results in the end. Concerning size and computational cost, each repetition lasted and it took 20 hours, almost 20 hours on specially dedicated machines. And the total computing time for the entire study was around 14,000 hours on these special dedicated machines. So really the probably one of the main drawbacks of the simulation here is that it is really heavy and really computationally expensive. So these are the temporal trends here. I'm going to illustrate to you on the top panel A. You have the moving average for each scenario. So this is the average over the 60 runs for each scenario of the newly recruited members. You have some sort of oscillations, and it is kind of a really hard to distinguish the patterns, especially because patterns seems to be really time dependent. And on the bottom, you have also the number of organized crime members. So in the first one, we really looked at the average of newly recruited members, while in the second panel, we'll look at the overall number of organized crime members. So those that were already members of an organized crime group, and those that were recruited at that timestamp. And you kind of distinguish a little bit more some patterns here. What is interesting is that with this fixed scenario, so keeping the average probability of committing crime fixed over the entire time period, you end up having some sort of a decline for each of the scenarios, even for the baseline one. So you have a sort of a peak, and then the trends go down, they decline, and they end up being a little bit lower than the original starting point. So what did we use for assessing the policy impact? We used generalized estimating equation, which are an extension of the popular generalized linear models, and they are explicitly designed to analyze longitudinal or cluster data in a panel form. What is the advantage of this method, and why did we use that? So first of all, it provides an unbiased estimation of the population average coefficient in spite of potential misspecification of the correlation structure. Compared to classic panel models, the generalized estimating equation doesn't gather subject-specific effects, which is something really interesting in our scenario, because first of all, we are dealing with some simulated societies, so we're not really concerned about the individual effects of each policy as on each simulation run, but we're more interested in the average effects and the significance and the magnitude of the average effect that a given intervention as on simulation, in this case, 60 simulations that share the same intervention. So we want to understand what is the average effect. It's similar to the same kind of a reasoning that clinician would try to achieve in understanding when trying to predicting for example, use of a certain drug or for some sort of disease. So we want to understand the average effect of the policy rather than looking at the individual specific effect for each of the simulations. These are the results. So we have here, first one is the newly recruited members. So the dependent variable here is the number of newly recruited individuals at each timestamp. And we have four models fit for each, we have four models each for each policy. And we also added some covariates here. So these are the policies. And when the IRR is lower than 1, it means that the policy reduce the number of newly recruited members compared to the baseline scenario with no policy, with no intervention. And then we also included progressively some sort of some covariates here to try to take into account the, let's say, the characteristics of each simulation. So we have the number of agents, we have the number of edges, and we also have the average C. So we wanted to take into account a control also for characteristics of the simulations that might vary across different runs, because again, the runs are not deterministic, and we let them vary within a certain bandwidth. And so these are the results. I'm gonna go over them in a more of a, let's say, intelligible way in a second. Then we also have the overall OC. The structure of the model is really the same. The dependent variable in this case is the number of OC members at each timestamp. We have the policies here. Again, when the IRR is lower than 1, it means that the policy is working. And then we also have the same set of covariates here. So the results here, these two graphs are only taking into account model 3 and model 4. So the models that use the higher number of covariates, so that we are using more robust estimates of the effect of the policy. And what we can see is that, first of all, what concern overall OC presence, we see that if we target OC leaders, we're gonna have a higher impact in reduction of the overall OC presence. Then slightly lower is the effect of the secondary socialization, but it is interesting to see that let's say a less traditional policy that doesn't really go into the law enforcement sphere, but really looks more in the welfare and social support domain, works almost as well as the law enforcement one. And then we have the targeting facilitator, so targeting people that facilitate contacts between OC members and people that are not ready to join the OC group. On average, reduce around 15% here, 15% in the number of OC present, of OC members. Sorry. Then, unfortunately, primary socialization, so removing the child from the OC father, doesn't really have a significant effect. So we have no evidence, no statistical robust evidence that this policy has an impact in reducing the overall OC presence. When we move instead on looking at the impact of each policy in reducing recruitment, so in preventing this process of people, especially young people, and joining the groups, we see that if we target the OC leaders again, we have a major effect. That is around 10% reduction in recruitment. This is probably because if we target the group, if we target the leader, we weaken the group, and the group is not able anymore in having the capacity and the capability to have a legitimacy and a strength in recruiting people in the same society. And then we have secondary socialization again that displays significant reduction, that is around 5%, which is interesting. And the other interesting thing is that also the other two policies really work. So they are around 4%. With minor variations. So the bars here is the standard deviation of the two models. And even though primary socialization, for example, wasn't working for the overall OC present, we see that the policy really has an impact in reducing organized crime recruitment. So the conclusions of the study: we were first able to develop theoretically and empirically grounded ABM simulations. So we calibrate, and we validate the models on real-world data, and we designed a model relying on well-established theory and criminological literature. And this really, I think, advances the field, because generally ABM applications in the previous studies really relied on theoretical assumption, but without combining them with empirical data. So these are, I think, the first strength. The other strength is that the applicability of these framework the framework can be applied to different geographical and criminal contexts. So provided that people can retrieve and process data on the different conditions, socioeconomic conditions, family conditions for other criminal contexts, this type of framework really works well also in other dimensions. So you can even try to model, for example, Mexican drug cartels if you inform the model data on Mexico, for example. In fact, we did this sort of experiment also with our Dutch colleagues. So we use the same framework to model recruitment and overall OC dynamics in the Netherlands. And then a probabilistic structure rather than a formal one, rather than those structures that are really common in ABM and the social sciences that are mostly based on if rules. So the probabilistic structure here really allows some sort of empirically motivated flexibility, and this really connects to the applicability to other criminal and geographical contexts. And then I think this is a good example of effective transdisciplinary collaboration and partnership between scientists and policymakers, because in the phase of developing the model and formalizing the model, foremost, we really engage with policymakers at the European and national level. We talk with prosecutors, we talk with law enforcement, and we try to understand what were really the challenges of stopping and preventing and reducing recruitment in these really difficult social contexts. However, the study comes also with some limitations. The first one is that we rely on a simplification of the definition of recruitment, although this is a sort of a legal simplification, because in many legal contexts, recruitment is defined as the commission of a crime with an organized crime associate. This, of course, not really the case in the real world. So the legal sphere lags behind, let's say, from real world dynamics, and probably a more complex way to model recruitment would be realistic. However, we had to make this simplification because we didn't have any data on other types of recruitment dynamics that could be defended from an empirical point of view. Then the limit number of agents, that it's definitely due to the computational cost and would probably cause some sort of potential scaling issues. So we cannot really assume that the same results that I have presented here would hold looking at, for example, societies with 100,000 agents. You can have some sort of non-linearities in the effects of the policies, and that is definitely something that we're eager to look into with the research group. And then also to conclude, also only one OC group, which is of course a simplification again, because there's no adversarial setting, no competition, and competition can have an impact both on overall OC dynamics and recruitment in a real world scenario. If I have time, I would like to leave you with some concluding reflection. Otherwise, if you think that I'm running out of time, I would leave the reflection, and if you have any questions or doubts or curiosities, I would be here to answer you.
I think you have a couple minutes for go ahead, and if you want to.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll try to be brief. Okay. So these are more of a reflection in general on computing criminology. As I told you before, there has been a surge in applications of agent-based modeling, but agent-based modeling is not the only methodology that has been applied to try to merge computational studies and computational sciences and the study and the analysis of crime. So we have a surge in the diffusion of computational applications, at least from since 2010. But beyond research, this pattern has also emerged in the public policy sphere. So, what factors did drive this kind of an evolution? Certainly, the higher availability of data is a main driver. It's a really important driver in explaining this process. But then also the democratization of programming language and statistical software that became accessible also to social scientists. And then the dramatic shift to quantitative measurement of crime. So people, both in public institutions and academia, were more and more interested in trying to quantify crime rather than just explaining it from a qualitative or anthropological point of view. And then the demand for data-driven public decisions, which also, of course, gave birth to some sort of business opportunities in the collaboration between research and academia. So computational methods can help in better understanding the complex, multifaceted nature of criminal behaviors. Yes, however, recent scandals related to racial and gender bias, discrimination, accountability, and algorithmic transparency call for profound changes in research and practice. So these are some of the headlines of the recent and less recent scandals that have been brought to the attention of the public, related to especially the use of predictive policing software in the United States that were found to reinforce discrimination and bias and racism and racial practices, which of course brought a flamboyant debate, and that again really called for profound changes in research and practice. I want to leave you with 4 possible pathways. Where I'm a criminologist, I'm a computational criminologist talking to people that work in the computational sciences and might have some sort of interest in the societal problems and in a combination of these 2 spheres. And these are 4 pathways that I think would be relevant to really try to respond to the profound reform in the way in which computational models are used to analyze and predict crime. And the first one is, and I think is a good example, and the study that I presented today, I think is a good example. It's an increasing integration and communication between communities working in the area. I think that if communities get together and work in a transdisciplinary philosophy, this is a safeguard for potential risky and harmful applications, both from the research and the practice point of view. Then definitely improving educational portfolios, both from the side of social scientists and computer scientists. Because there's a trend of incorporating ethics courses and computer science degrees and curricula, and at the same time there is some efforts in incorporating more advanced statistical and computational courses in social sciences. This integration and this improvement in the curriculum doesn't have to be some sort of a empty container of progress, but I really think it's the key to make sure that the future generations will really understand the risks that some methods and some technologies would pose to society. And then widening the scope outside of the United States and the Western world, I think it's because many assumptions about crime and criminal behavior are made on the gigantic literature that comes from the United States or the United Kingdom or the Netherlands, while there are a lot of other countries that are experiencing crime, and crime is not really homogeneous across the globe. And foremost, there are a lot of contexts in which predictive policing software, surveillance softwares have been deployed in non-democratic countries, developing countries. So we really need to widen the scope beyond the United States and the Western world to understand what is what are the risks and what are the harms that are perpetrated to people around the world in the context of crime and crime control. And then finally, I think it is really crucial to investigating human knowledge and perceptions. So how much people know about predictive policing, how much people understand about predictive policing, and how much people is willing to accept how much how much reduction of freedom people is willing to accept in the use of these technological tools. And if we try to, gather these answers and we try to investigate human knowledge and better engage with communities and with people, we can realistically try to, track a trajectory of these technologies and try to modify the perceptions that people have about these technologies that ultimately can really play a role in how these technologies will develop in the next decades. So this is the resource information. This is a paper full citation just published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. The code is open access at this repo. And thanks for your attention. Again, really, thank you for inviting me.